The next section that I'm going to demonstrate will be the DCO modulation. Now this modulates both the DCOs together, or if it's just a one DCO patch, then obviously it'll just modulate that. I'm going to demonstrate this with LFO1, LFO2 and a little bit with the super LFOs. So first I'll select the DCO modulation setting. I've just got a pretty standard string patch here. So firstly I will just modulate the DCO tune. So that's the modulation depth, modulated with LFO1 using a triangle wave. This is also an opportunity for me to go through all the waveforms of the LFOs because the waveforms are selected for each modulation parameter rather than at the actual LFO themselves. So that will give you a choice of various waveforms at the various modulation destinations. So first of all, we'll modulate using triangle wave. We then change that to 180 degrees out of phase triangle wave. Now you might be thinking, oh, what's the point of that? But if you are modulating two parameters at the same time, then while one peaks, the other parameter will be troughing, so you'll get a opposite phase relationship between the two. So it can create some quite nice effects when modulating various parameters. Next will be the sawtooth. The inverse of that will be the ramp. The next one is a sine wave. It's really a smoother version of the triangle wave, obviously, but it's quite a bit smoother. Sine wave out of phase. There's also a delay setting that you can use to change the phase of the various waveforms at an angle that's less than 180 degrees. The next one is the pulse wave. Now this is a variable pulse setting as well, so you can change the pulse width from 0 to 100%. So that could be quite good for certain effects. As you can see, this one's on for 75% of the time and off for 25%. This inverse. Now the next waveform is sample and hold. I mean, that sounds better with a faster speed, but you know, whatever you need it to do, it does. There's also two other sample and hold settings that allow you to sync the sample and hold to Midi or to the sequencer. So it's these two, and then finally you use the envelope generator number 3 to create the to be the LFO. And then the inverse of that. So there are a lot of different waveforms that you can use to modulate the various parameters. Next I'll change the LFO source. So I'll go back to a sawtooth. The source, so you've got 4 LFOs to choose from, so it's LFO1, LFO2 is a bit quicker, but that might be a nice one to demonstrate sample and hold. When I say it's a bit quicker, I mean it's set at a quicker rate at the moment. And then LFO3 or Super LFO3, set at a very slow rate. You can make that very slow if you need it to be. And finally LFO4. In the LFO section, I'll demonstrate the various pulse widths as well that you can change. So I'll set the LFO source back to 1. So choose the pulse, which I've got at the moment. Switch to LFO1. Pulse width setting is parameter 5. As you can see, the on pulse is getting steadily smaller. Until it's practically off all the time at the lower setting. And then the inverse of that. At very fast rates, these will give a slightly different sound as well. So if I speed up LFO2, make the source LFO2, and then change the waveform. And then play with the pulse width of LFO2. And you get various sounds there. Also go to sample and hold. Lower the speed a bit. I'll go through the rest of the DCO tune parameters before I go back to the LFO settings. So in addition to the LFO modulation, you can also add the envelope generator 3 to modulate it as well. So currently we've got modulation with the LFO. Now if we turn up envelope generator 3 modulation depth, you can choose whether you want to add the waveform or subtract the waveform. So this is currently subtracting the waveform. Now to add the waveform, now currently the modulation depth of the LFO is on full, so if we turn that down, then we can hear the effect of the adding the waveforms. You also have an option to apply the pitch bend setting to the modulation depth to increase the modulation depth. So this is using parameter 8. So we'll turn down the envelope generator depth, switch up the LFO depth, go back to parameter 8 without the pitch bend amount, and you've got that much modulation. But if you add the pitch bend amount, which is currently on set to full, then you've got a bit more to play with. So I can then bring up the envelope generator 3 settings. So again, it's quite a unique modulation waveform you can create by combining the two modulation sources. Next I'll go through some more of the LFO settings. So I have previously demonstrated the frequency of the LFO. So first parameter, LFO frequency. The second parameter is a delay parameter, so you can put a nice delay in before the LFO kicks in. So the LFO can also be triggered using the sequencer or free running. It can also invert the delay as well. That's quite a nice little feature, because you obviously start with the effect and then it removes the modulation source after a particular amount of time. So next up in the LFO1 parameters is a parameter to use super low frequency oscillator 3 to frequency modulate LFO1. So this effectively modulates the modulator. So currently LFO1 is being used to modulate DCO modulation. I will turn up the modulation depth of super LFO3 to modulate LFO1. And as you can see, over time the modulation speed will vary. If I turn down the frequency of super LFO3, then it will modulate over a longer period of time. And then you can change the waveform of super LFO3. I'll just turn up the speed of LFO3 again. and then I can change the waveform. So lots of interesting things you can do by modulating the modulator.